Highly intelligent Gen X women have these 10 strange habits, Psychology Explained. A woman in her late 50s is on the phone with her adult daughter. The daughter is venting from her car between meetings. The mother listens. She asks 2 questions that crack the problem open. There's a pause. Then the daughter says, "Mom, you're so smart." The smile is automatic. What's not automatic is the small clench in the jaw, the one that happens exactly half a second before the smile, not after. Nobody else in the room can see it. She isn't sure she's noticing it herself. The compliment didn't land as a gift. It landed as confirmation of a label that's been doing a job since she was 9 years old, in around 1975. This is a video about the psychology of highly intelligent Gen X women. Specifically, women born between 1965 and 1980. Women who were gifted, tracked in school between 1975 and 1990. Women who entered workforces, still figuring out what to do with female intelligence. You've probably watched a few videos like this one. Most of them list 10 habits: talking to yourself, staying up late, messy desks, overthinking, loving solitude, and label the pattern as a sign of high IQ. The implicit promise is recognition. You see yourself. You feel less alone. You scroll on. This video is going to do something different. Here is the claim. Those 10 habits competitor videos describe are not 10 separate things. They are 10 surface expressions of one underlying mechanism. The mechanism has a name. It has been named for almost 50 years. The name has not traveled to the women it best describes. The name is intellectualization. In 1977, a psychiatrist named George Vaillant published a book called Adaptation to Life. It was based on a study Harvard had been running since 1938, tracking the same group of people for what is now over 80 years. One of Vaillant's main contributions was a 4-tier classification of psychological defenses. The tiers, in order, are pathological, immature, neurotic, and mature. Intellectualization sits in the 3rd tier. Neurotic, not mature. Here is what that means in plain language. Sublimation: the mature defense converts grief into a painting, a novel, a piece of music. It transforms what is underneath. Intellectualization, by contrast, converts grief into a spreadsheet about grief. It doesn't transform the feeling. It stores it, indexed and unfelt, in a place the body still has to keep funded. Here is what that looks like in lived experience. It's 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The reading glasses are still on. The laptop is open. 7 browser tabs are visible. An academic paper on Hashimoto's antibody markers. A Reddit thread on supplement interactions. The patient portal of an endocrinologist whose appointment is 6 weeks out. A 2019 cohort study. Her own search history from the last 45 minutes. She is not in panic. She is in research. She is preparing for a conversation that hasn't been scheduled yet. The body needs sleep. The nervous system is preparing for a threat 6 weeks away. One of those 2 systems is in charge, and it's not the one that needs sleep. That is intellectualization in plain sight. A brief note before we go further. This video discusses defense mechanisms, childhood adaptation, and chronic stress. It is not a substitute for therapy. If anything in this conversation touches something that needs more support than a video can offer, please reach out to a licensed mental health professional. Now back to the architecture. What competitor videos call the 10 signs of highly intelligent women is a description of intellectualization manifesting through 10 different daily channels. Talking to yourself is the mechanism becoming audible. Staying up late is the mechanism continuing when external demands recede. The messy desk is what happens when cognitive resources are entirely allocated to processing. Anticipatory analysis is the mechanism rehearsing future conversations. The relentless questioning is the mechanism doing its job, which is to never let an unprocessed thing settle. One thing. 10 faces. And the word intelligent, every time it gets used, keeps the costume on. If you grew up in the United States as a girl between roughly 1972 and 1985, 4 institutions were running in your background: home, school, culture, workforce. All 4 simultaneously rewarded one specific behavior. The behavior was being capable, ahead, prepared, and quiet about it. Let me show you what that looked like, in detail. The detail matters more than the summary. You remember the smell of the mimeographed worksheet, the damp purple ink, sweet and slightly chemical. You used to put your face close to the paper to inhale it. Nobody told you not to. It was probably toxic. The first place you were trained to be smart smelled like that, in a classroom between 1975 and 1985, and the smell is in your nose right now watching this. You also remember the drills. Crouching under your desk, knees pressed into the linoleum that was always slightly cold, hands laced over the back of your neck, and the specific moment, somewhere around age 10, when you understood without anyone telling you that this wouldn't actually help if it happened. You didn't tell the teacher. You crouched anyway. That was the first time you knew something the adults didn't, and kept it to yourself. That was a small moment. It's also where the pattern starts knowing something, keeping it to yourself, finding the room safer for the secret than for the truth. That was the school institution. Now let's look at home. There's a body of research from family system psychology going back to a 1973 book by Ivan Bozorman-Yanagi and Geraldine Spark called Invisible Loyalties. The concept is parentification, the assignment of adult roles to children. There are two recognized subtypes. Instrumental parentification means taking on practical tasks. Childcare, household logistics, family translation. Emotional parentification means becoming a parent's regulator, confidant, soother, crisis, manager. The smart one in the family often performs both. She solves homework problems for her younger siblings. She translates her father's anger to her mother. She knows how to read her mother's silence by the way the dishwasher gets loaded. By age 9, she is providing infrastructure the family didn't notice it was relying on. The infrastructure worked. The household ran. She built a kind of early competence that her later professional life would draw on for 40 years. That was real. The cost was only this. The role gave her no exit. There was no version of the family that would have functioned with her standing down. Add the latchkey years. By the early 1990s, approximately 3.5 million American children were coming home from school to empty houses, about 7% of children aged 5 to 13. The phenomenon peaked around 1,989. A large share of those children were Gen X girls, 2 to 3 hours daily of unsupervised self-direction, beginning around age 8. A 2004 marketing study famously described this generation as one of the least parented in U.S. history. That phrasing has been challenged. But the underlying behavioral pattern that you were running infrastructure for yourself, and often for younger siblings, by the time you were 10 has held up across decades of follow-up research on this cohort. Then there's the workforce. You entered it in the late 1980s or 1990s as one of 2 or 3 women in your department. The accommodation strategy you learned in childhood, be capable, stay quiet, don't make others feel small, became professionally adaptive. Sally Reese, at the University of Connecticut, has spent decades documenting that gifted women specifically dim their intellectual output downward in social and professional contexts. They do this at higher rates than equivalently gifted men. The behavior had a name in the research literature by 1995. It still doesn't have one in most workplaces. You may already be doing the math on this, adding the years you've spent calibrating downward in rooms that were not yet ready for you. The arithmetic gets heavy. 4 institutions, 1 decade, same behavior rewarded. And then, somewhere between 3rd grade and 5th grade, an adult said it out loud. Perhaps your 4th grade teacher, after a spelling test. Perhaps your father at a holiday dinner in 1979. In front of cousins who immediately repositioned themselves slightly. Perhaps an aunt at a graduation. She's the smart one. 3 words. You didn't choose the label. It chose you. And then it stayed. From that day in your 4th grade classroom in 1978, or that holiday dinner in 1979, or that aunt's living room in 1981, anything that wasn't smart had less room to exist inside you. Crying wasn't smart. Saying you didn't know wasn't smart. Asking for help wasn't smart. The label was not a description of what you were. It was a job assignment for what you were going to be. This is the part the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott named in a series of papers in the 1960s. He used the term false self, a self organized around what the environment will reliably accept. The false self isn't a lie in Winnicott's framework. It's a survival arrangement. It protects the true self, the spontaneous, felt, vulnerable core, by keeping it underground. A false self organized around a praised trait is unusually durable. The praise keeps coming. Every time someone says you're so smart, the arrangement gets reinforced from the outside. The true self never gets a chance to come up for air, because the false self is doing too well at its job. This is where the label becomes the trap. Let's go back to specifics. Here are two scenes that come up over and over in conversations with women in this age range. The first one. It's the third Tuesday of a meditation class she signed up for in January because her primary care doctor used the word cortisol in a sentence. She's on the mat, eyes closed, 60 seconds into the first silent sit. The instructor's voice has stopped. The room is quiet except for the heating vent. Within 90 seconds of silence, her mind has planned tomorrow's grocery list. Identified the vent hum as B-flat. Drafted a response to her brother's text from yesterday. Started designing a more efficient layout for the studio's storage closet, which she has only ever seen from the doorway. Her breath in those same 90 seconds has not reached her belly once. The chest is doing the breathing. The belly is on standby. This is not leisure. This is the only thing her nervous system knows how to do when there is nothing to do. That's Stephen Porges's polyvagal framework in lived experience. The body has three primary autonomic states: ventral vagal, which is rest and engagement, sympathetic, which is mobilization, and dorsal vagal, which is shutdown. Cognitive hyperarousal is what sustained sympathetic dominance feels like from the inside. Racing thoughts, difficulty focusing on one thing, the inability to drop into the kind of rest where the mind goes quiet. And here is what matters. This same sympathetic activation was the system that kept her safe at 9, alone in the house from 3:15 to 6:10 p.m. It scanned the rooms. It read the silences. It made her capable when no adult was available to be capable for her. The vigilance was not a malfunction. It was the function. It still is, when she needs it. The cost is only this. The system never learned how to stop. She has been in this state for 45 years. The earliest training was in elementary school drills in 1976, and the nervous system has not been off-duty since. 45 years is what it has been doing, not what it is. That distinction matters. Here's the second scene. It's 4:23 on a Wednesday afternoon. She's loaded her groceries into the trunk 11 minutes ago. The cart is back in the corral. The car is started. She hasn't shifted into drive. She's been sitting in the same position for nearly 5 minutes, hand on the wheel. Inside her head, 4 things are happening simultaneously. She's drafting 3 versions of an email to her sister about mom's care. She's running tax loss harvesting math for December. She's identifying the song on the radio as one her college roommate played in the spring of 1989. She's noticing the woman walking past has the same hair color she had at 32. It's not stress, it's the default. The only reason she notices it is because she's not moving. This is what the cost of intellectualization looks like at 55. Not dramatic, not collapse. Just the recognition, in a parking lot, that the mind has not been empty, not relaxed, empty for as long as she can remember. There's a 2010 review by Robert Paul Juster, Bruce McEwen, and Sonia Lupien. It documented what chronic activation does to the brain and body over decades. A 2025 study in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience documented something similar. Older adults with elevated allostatic load showed measurable changes in frontal and temporal gray matter, the regions associated with attention and emotional regulation. The cost is not metaphorical, it is anatomical. There's also something the Australian researcher Muraka Gross documented in a 20-year longitudinal study of children with exceptionally high IQs. She found that they reported a persistent experience of being adjacent to social groups rather than inside them, present, engaged, but always slightly outside the center. Not as personality. as a cognitive processing artifact. The depth of analysis creates observational distance from spontaneous belonging. And one more layer. Dana Crowley-Jack, in her 1991 book Silencing the Self, documented that women specifically dim their emotional voices to preserve relationships. Sally Rice's research extended this finding to intellectual voice. The two together describe one phenomenon operating across two channels. And here too, the both, and matters. Editing herself down in the workplace of 1989 is what kept her employable in a department where the men did not yet know what to do with her. Editing herself down at the family dinner in 1995 is what kept her sister from feeling small. The editing was not weakness. It was the survival strategy of someone who was correct that the room was not yet safe for the full version of her. The cost was only this. She edited for so long that the unedited version became unfamiliar to her. Emotional voice, down. Intellectual voice, down. Cumulative cost compounded over decades, the 1980s through the 2010s. The constant fake persona that makes you want to walk away and never come back, which I've seen described, almost word for word, in comment sections under videos like this one, has a research name. It is the cumulative cost of double-channel self-silencing. This is what the 10 habits have been doing. They have been keeping the false self functional while it managed the mismatch between what your environments would accept and what was actually true beneath them. The habits have served you, and the habits have charged you. Both things are real. Here's the question this video has been building toward. You've been doing the math, anticipating the problems, calibrating the rooms, solving the family structural issues, drafting the email 3 ways before sending it, scanning every social situation for what's about to be needed of you. All of this since you were 9 years old. For 45 years, with 4 institutions cheering you on. What has all of that been protecting you from? That is the diagnostic question. Not a rhetorical one. A literal one. Here's how to use it. Tonight, before sleep, ask yourself one question. Not why am I so tired that has too many answers, and your mind will pick the easy one. Instead ask this. If my mind stopped solving things for 10 minutes, if I could not plan, anticipate, calculate, or analyze what would come up to be felt. Don't try to answer it tonight. Hold the question. Notice what your body does when you ask it. You might find your jaw releases, or tightens. You might feel a small heat behind your sternum. You might feel nothing at all, which is its own piece of information. If nothing comes up, note the absence. Note whether the absence feels neutral or feels like a wall. The answer that matters is not the one your mind offers. It is the half-second of bodily response before the story arrives. This is not a meditation practice. It's a diagnostic instrument. The point is not to make the mind quiet. The point is to find out what the mind has been busy keeping from getting through. One question. One night. No homework after. Tonight, ask the question your mind has been too busy thinking to ask. A last thing. This channel exists because women in this cohort, born between 1965 and 1980, sitting in the long quiet after the loud decades, deserve psychology that names what they have actually lived. Not psychology that flatters them with what other content has assumed they want to hear. If that's what you're here for, subscribe. The work continues with you, not at you. And one comment prompt, because the comment section under videos like this one is where the real conversation happens. If you have a moment, share this. When did you first realize you'd been called smart before you'd been called anything else? What year? What room? What adult? You don't have to answer publicly if you don't want to, but if you do, someone else watching the comments will see her own 9th year in your sentence, and that may matter more than the video.